Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fifth webinar in the Unlocking Knowledge Transfer series. The aim of these webinars is to highlight the difference in the areas of knowledge transfer throughout the Irish system. And this month, we're looking at the open research and intellectual property protection. By 2020, Ireland plans to achieve 100% open access to research publications. And this webinar will provide insights into the research. This will provide open research across the higher education sector and how this may work while protecting intellectual property. We have a great lineup of speakers today, and I would like to introduce them to you now in alphabetical order. We have Dr. Daniel Bangert, a National Open Research Coordinator, Digital Repository of Ireland, Royal Irish Academy. We have Patricia Clark, Programme Manager, Policy and EU Funding, Health Research Board, and Ian Gallivan, Commercialisation Executive with NUI Galway. Our moderator today is Vincent Wall, and just before I hand over to Vincent, the structure for this morning's session is in the form of a panelist discussion. As always, we welcome questions, so please feel free to type them into the question and answer section on the platform at any stage throughout this morning, and we'll pose them to our panel members. The webinar is being recorded this morning and will be available to play back on the KTI website over the coming days. And with that, I'll hand you over to Vincent.
Thanks indeed, Rowena. This is a particularly interesting topic for me because more than usual, I have an awful lot to learn, but we have three great panelists, as Rowena introduced there, so I'm really looking forward to this. We might come to you first, Daniel, if that's okay with you. I know you were appointed as the National Open Research Coordinator about a year and a half ago. Firstly, from the little bit of research I've done into this, excuse the pun, it seems there can be some ambiguity, confusion as to some of the terminology that we're talking about here in terms of open research, open science, other terms. Can you settle that one for us firstly, and then broadly speaking, explain your role as coordinator and a member of the National Open Research Forum?
Absolutely, thanks Vincent, and thanks to Knowledge Transfer Ireland for the discussion today. So open science or open research, and in general, I'll be using these as equivalent to each other. So we've chosen here in the Irish context to use open research as perhaps being more inclusive of all disciplines as a broader term, but science can also be understood in that way.
So effectively, broadly speaking, we're talking about the same thing.
Absolutely, yes,
yeah.
Yes. So in terms of what it means, I like to refer to a definition that's given by UNESCO. It comes from their recommendation on open science, which was adopted in November last year. And that's really truly a global framework that's adopted by all of the member states. So I think that's a good starting point. And they set this out in three parts. So they talk about open science as an inclusive construct that combines various movements and practices, aiming to make multilingual scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable for everyone. Secondly, to increase scientific collaborations and sharing of information for the benefits of science and society, and also to open the processes of scientific knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication to societal actors beyond the traditional scientific community. So I think this captures three of the key elements there around it being, I guess, an umbrella term for various movements. It increases scientific collaboration and also extends who's involved in the process. So what do we mean by open practices? This can also then be quite broad, but traditionally we've talked a lot about open access to research publications, which continue to be a key part of this, but this is broadened out to open research data, also the sorts of tools and software that we use, workflows, the concept of citizen science, open educational resources, and alternative methods for research evaluation. And the arguments in favor of open research talk about it as benefiting the collective in that we share outputs with the global community. This positions research as a global public good, and it helps, I guess, the more rapid and transparent sharing of outputs that we have. This is not just for the benefit of academic communities, but for potential applications to industry, for example, to inform policymakers or for open communication and the involvement of the public. So that's how I would frame open science.
Okay, and I think in your description there, or using UNESCO's description, the open research element of open science or open access is that it won't just be the data that will be openly available, it will be the methodologies and the code if required as well. So effectively the whole process, including the technological support that underpins it.
Exactly. It touches on all elements of the research life cycle. And if we talk about maximizing transparency and reproducibility, then we need openness to all of those elements as well, so that the methods can be understood and potentially reproduced and verified.
Now, we'll come to you in more detail through our conversation about the actual elements of Ireland's national plan and perhaps some of the challenges you'll face. But broadly speaking, where does our national plan stand? And is this part of a wider European Union framework or drive?
Yeah, absolutely. At the national level, much of the direction momentum for open research has been channeled via the National Open Research Forum. So talking about my role specifically, this is a group of stakeholder representatives, over 90 directly involved. This includes institutions, different associations, library groups, funders, and other bodies across the research system in Ireland, who have come together really for strategic discussion and to identify ways in which we can move forward in a coordinated way. So what are the concrete actions and objectives that we want to set and move towards? So there's been a few key milestones here. In 2019, the national framework on a transition to an open research environment set the national objectives. And we're just at the point of delivering a national action plan, which will put in place some of those actions to realize our national ambitions in this area. And this is very much following on from international recommendations, the Commission recommendation from 2018 in this area on the preservation and access to scientific information, as well as the UNESCO recommendation from last year. So the momentum is all one way, and North is a way to bring Ireland together under this agenda.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. And we might come to Patricia next, because I know you're a member of NORF, or the National Open Research Forum yourself, Patricia, but you're speaking to us today with your Health Research Bureau hat on, so to speak. And the HRB was the first, I understand, the first organisation, agency in Ireland to establish an open research platform. Why did you do that, and how is it working?
Yeah, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Absolutely. I mean, the Health Research Board is a public research funder, and we have an obligation to manage the funding well, and also to make sure that we get maximum value out of the research that we fund. Our strategy commits us to building a strong and enabling environment for health research in Ireland, and to provide leadership to shape, review, conduct and govern research. So for us, the HRB Open Research Open Publication Platform provided us with a mechanism to actually bring together all of those aspects related to open research, to work in partnership with our research community to actually help and to show how to do things in practice. So the theory has been there for a couple of years. I mean, we're all very familiar with the international papers and the policies that have been put in place, but this was a very practical approach to actually looking at how to work with people on the ground to actually deliver open publication with underlying open data, open peer review, and to see how it worked. So the HRB itself is a learning organisation. We wanted to know how to do this better. We wanted to know how to support people to do it, and to be able to look at whether it was possible and what we could achieve. So we tendered, we put an open tender out to work with an academic publisher, to work directly on providing a service for our research community that would support them to work more openly. This is something that we built on the back of a model from Wellcome in the UK and the Gates Foundation, and it's since been taken up by a number of other funders throughout Europe and broader field. So I don't know if you want me to go into the detail of how it works.
Yeah, well, I think you're up and running even from a very formative stage, about 4 years now, Patricia. So yes. How are the people that you're funding in terms of their research and the other stakeholders in that community, how are they adapting to the platform? How's it working, I suppose?
Yeah, as you say, we started 4 years ago first to establish the platform, to work with the community, to sort of meet with them. So F1000 had over 70 meetings with different groups or institutions throughout Ireland that we fund, to talk to them about what the platform would be and how it was different and why we wanted to change the way that we did things. We've had a fantastic response to it. So at the moment, it's the #1 publication site for all of our funded researchers. So we've been delighted with the actual uptake of the system, but also with the system itself in the way that it allows early and open sharing of research. It allows us to look at different types of research outputs. So it's not just the traditional peer-reviewed paper, it's also peer-reviewed data sets, negative results, data notes, study protocols, lots of different types of outputs. So to make best use of all of the outputs of research rather than just the traditional papers. I know when we ask our researchers, they say that they will use it, and I mean, they have been using it to great effect over the past 4 years. So it's built up over time as a new sort of publication platform. We know we had to sort of embed it within the system, look at getting it indexed into the bibliographic systems, and make sure that people were aware that it works to the very high standards of any other publication that people would expect. So there's a suite of policies behind it, a very fast and efficient approach to using it, and the HRB pays the cost directly, so there's no author facing charges for it. So I mean, it's been unique in that it combines sort of early publication. So we would see our publications being published within roughly around 10-11 days from submission, and the actual peer review process roughly around 100 to 110 days. They would be peer reviewed. There is newer types of publications being published by our researchers at the moment, particularly study protocols, which provide sort of early peer review on methodology and approach to research. So it makes for early sharing of researcher, and that's combined with an open peer review process. So once the paper is published, the peer review comes after the publication rather than before. And those peer review reports are also published alongside the papers to allow for insight into changes that have been made in different versioning.
Okay, Ian Gallivan, thanks for waiting there. At least the weather's good in Galway, I can see. And I know you've been listening to both Daniel and Patricia with great interest. In the case of the Health Research Board, the HRB, being public money, so to speak, their requirements is that the research that they fund is compatible with open research standards, and that's understandable as it's taxpayers' money to a degree. You in NUI Galway and other academic research institutions around the country, often have to deal with collaborative projects that involve private sector funding as well, from SMEs, from larger private businesses. What does the concept of open research mean to you, and can you see some issues there in terms of that private sector funding and what open research will mean to those funders?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's always been the case that the funder has terms and conditions. What we're seeing through NORF and SFI and the public funders is the emphasis on open research and open science, which is fine. And Daniel and Patricia have outlined the benefits and the broader societal benefits. That's not necessarily compatible with the aims of collaborative research, because collaborative research is the coming together of two funding sources to address a research question that is of interest to both parties. And I suppose the distinction really is a greater emphasis on the research question and the likely outputs that will arise as part of the research process. So heretofore, maybe there was a kind of setting of a rule set around intellectual property identification, intellectual property rights and the management thereof, and maybe a retrospective look once the research is completed as to, well, what have we got? I think my learnings from this principally is around forward-looking. It's looking into the research process as to where intellectual assets may arise, because there will be outputs. They're all a manifestation of an intellectual asset. Then there's a question of whether intellectual property can be defined, and then the question is whether an intellectual property right can be assigned, because these aren't incompatible stories. These aren't incompatible, but it's more a question of taking a forward-looking view as opposed to a retrospective view for all parties will determine where the value is likely to occur, who are the beneficiaries of the value, whether an open science and commercial entities goals are aligned, or whether there may be different perspectives on it. And I think there's an underlying principle in all of this where the research will be as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. And the determination of how that works, what I think the funders are saying to us, what the funders are saying to us is that we really need to think further and deeper as to what that means for each research question, and to make a predetermination as to where the value will arise, who is interested in it, and what each party would require or need to deliver on that value.
Daniel, do you want to pick up on that? Because to my secular ears, that is a key question, as I suppose, as we move towards implementing our national plan, where there are collaborative research projects, where there's private or business money going into it as well, and where intellectual assets or intellectual property may arise as outputs. Some private sector funders in particular might be concerned about what open research means, total access to those intellectual assets that they might be part funding. How does that play in your plan?
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. And just to pick up on what Ian said there, I agree there that we don't need to set these as binaries. There's not an incompatibility there, but it's two sets of principles that we need to understand and work with. So IPR providing the necessary legal framework within which open science can operate. So to go back to as open as possible, this is really about achieving that balance between disseminating knowledge, the need to protect, but I guess the default position there is open. So maximizing openness, and then considering what might need to be protected, whether that's sensitive personal data, something that's commercially sensitive, or data likely to harm a community. So I think that planning is the key. We see this in requirements, for example, for data management planning, for other kinds of things that are needed throughout a grant proposal or a funded project, in which need to consider what outputs will be produced, to what degree they can be shared, what are the appropriate venues for sharing and for preservation.
So that broad conceptual approach, as open as possible, as closed as necessary, would see commercial output, commercial assets arising from collaborative research being protected to some degree, as long as it's planned from the start.
That's the principle that we've carried through into the national documentation, and it's based on the European and international view. Yeah.
What I suppose one of the questions I suspect you have in your head, Ian, and I see it's a question that's come in from one of our members of the audience, is where does this whole concept of open research and the national plan that Daniel and his colleagues are putting together fit in with the national IP protocol?
Again, a very good question. I think that it's somewhat an emergent thing. The national IP protocol is a really good basis in terms of establishing a set of rules, a set of principles, and they're fairly thoroughly thought through in terms of the different use cases for research, for public money and private money coming together to achieve a research output. I don't see any compatibilities with it. I mean, Daniel's point was that your default position is now open. Well, for most research performing organizations, it was to publish. I think we've and what Patricia's outlined is different methodologies and ways to achieve the openness and ways of facilitating it. So it's easier, it's more transparent, it's more inclusive, it's broader, but it still harmonizes on the core publication need for research performing organizations. So that was always there. Now it's a richer set. The National IP Protocol is that set of rules where you made a valorization decision and you know that certain assets now need to be treated differently from the default completely open, because you've done the analysis, you've looked forward, you've talked to the stakeholders, you've determined where value is, you've determined who can operationalize that value, and you've determined whether putting an asset in the public domain and letting the community drive value, you have that option, you always have that option, and that's the closest analogy maybe to open source. But it's a planned progression through the research project. And I think the IP protocol is that document that guides us towards the correct allocation of IP assets based on the recognition of the financial contributions. But before that, we have that analysis around what constitutes, what can be open, what degree of openness we need, what way of treating assets serves the needs of both parties. And that's a very necessary conversation with all the stakeholders, really at the onset of projects. And if there's anything that I'm taking out of the open research strategy, is to have those conversations. And we have them all the time with our collaborative research partners, but we now have this need to sort of think it through. Not so much our right to have a right, but our right that you're going to achieve something, and how are you going to achieve it, and what is the best way to do that. So to me, this is a very good driver for having high value conversations at the onset or the inception of research projects.
Patricia, coming back to you, just in terms of how your open research platform works, and I think you said there were 1,000 authors on it now at this stage, 4 years on. There are some processes, and there is some sort of light touch editorial overview in terms of meeting certain compliance, and then the whole peer review process, as you say, pretty quickly afterwards. But it's pretty light touch and pretty open to trust and professional integrity on the platform.
Yeah, God, I mean, when the article is actually submitted, and the editorial team will help people to submit, and there is a central contact from the HRB to actually provide additional support to any researchers to look at underlying data and how to link that and where trusted repositories are, all of that kind of insight before publication. I would say that there is an in-house editorial team, but it's up to the researcher to decide what to publish, not the editor. So that is a difference for us in that there's no publication biases inherent in the process.
So that's where the first open element comes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the editorial team, I would understate that they provide a comprehensive pre-publication check to make sure all of the checks that would be done in a publication in a normal journal are covered. They work to the highest level of international best practice with all of the policy suite that they follow here. And then once the paper is actually published, at that stage, when the article's finalized, it's up on the system, that's when the peer review kicks in. So it's an open peer review. You know who's peer reviewing your paper, and the actual peer review report is published alongside the publication. The researchers then address the publication or address the peer review, provide an updated version of it until it gets to the sort of point where there's 2 positive peer review ticks green ticks, as we call them, to ensure that this has met the standards for publication and peer review. And at that stage, it can be indexed in the bibliometric databases. So, I mean, it is an iterative process and a supportive process, so that the peer review is actually there to help prepare the paper as such, and to make sure that it's, you know, they've thought through it and had that open discussion, and it's fully visible to anybody who wants to read it.
But even then, when it's, you know, indexed, it still remains a living, breathing document, doesn't it? In the sense that people can contribute can continue to contribute, to comment, and the original authors can amend as see fit.
Absolutely. So there's a built-in versioning, live versioning within the system. So you can update your paper. It can be peer reviewed again by the same peer reviewers, and you can address the concerns. And it's all published online, in that you can see what changes have been suggested, what changes have been taken up, and how they've been addressed within the updated version of the publication.
I have a question here for you, Patricia, just while we have you. Did you say study protocols are reviewed after publication? And
yes.
What does this mean?
All of the publications, they're published first and peer reviewed secondly. So absolutely, I mean, for us, study protocols is something that we've looked at and thought, you know, it really is a way to get a peer review on the methodology before the data collection even starts. To look at, you know, how to actually front load some of that expertise and input. So the study protocol is published and peer reviewed. And at that stage, if it's linked into something like a registered report, where you can link your study protocol with your final publication paper, or a study protocol in its own right, the peer review is there and for all to see. So
the questioner actually has a supplementary. He says, he says some of the protocol sponsors might not want to have it shared with others, as it also involves patent issues. But I assume that's very clear from your funding protocols from the start.
Absolutely. And this will be discussed with the researchers when they're actually publishing. So to give you an example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we ran sort of very rapid calls for research. At that stage, we mandated all of our researchers who were funded for the COVID-19 calls to publish their study protocols online. And this gave us a second chance at peer reviewing the methodology that would be used to underlie the research. It also served to make sure that those study protocols were findable within the research system. They were automatically loaded into PubMed, for instance, so they were findable at a very early stage of the research. So it was kind of like a pre-look at what type of research would be coming out of those calls. So it served us very well in that purpose. And we found that there's been a spillover into other funding programs that we run now, in that there are a lot of study protocols coming online, and we're beginning to see those study protocols linked to different papers that are being published within the system. Okay.
Daniel, I suppose to broaden it out to a macro level again, where are we with the National Action Plan? I know Rowena at the very start said I think you have a 2030 target date for the key elements of it, which you might share with us now, what those key elements are and what their purpose is.
Yeah, so the National Action Plan has been developed over the last year and a half, and it's running from 2022 out to 2030. And this is a national vision for a system fully aligned with open research principles and practices. And we've categorized these in 3 themes. So the main objectives here are to establish a culture of open research, achieving 100% open access to research publications, and enabling fair research data and other outputs. So those are the 3 common themes, I guess, and they encapsulate a whole range of, I guess, actions and goals that need to move forward in a somewhat coordinated way. So without the incentives for this, without the skills and training, we can't move forward on the other elements, such as open access and fair data. These need to be well understood, and be embedded in what institutions, what funders and so on require, and reward within their systems for research and for researchers.
And fair data, I've only learned myself what fair data is, but just in case somebody looking in doesn't know, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's where that principle of
yeah. They're obviously very important concepts. Findable, accessible, interoperable, meaning you can interact dynamically with the platforms, with the research.
Yeah, this means also for humans and machines that the information can be understood and be transferred across systems, and also for cross-disciplinary research being able to be integrated and harmonized and analyzed at a broader scale. I should mention that both fair and open, these are concepts in which you don't necessarily have achieve them or don't achieve them. These can be considered on a spectrum. So you have increasing degrees of fairness. It's the same with openness. It's best to think of it on a spectrum. So you may have restricted or mediated access as well. So there's nuances to these principles. Okay.
I have a question here, which I think probably, I'll put to you first, Ian, seeing as what your role is. The National IP Protocol has licensing templates for both patents and software, but doesn't really address data issues and open source software. There's no mention in the National IP Protocol of open source software or data. In addition, more and more technology commercialization is moving towards softer IP, such as data, know-how, and copyright. These are IP assets that fall under the open research agenda. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and if you look at the two preceding questions, there's kind of a thread building up there from John and Kevin. So I might just go back to John's question first, because
that makes sense, actually. Yeah.
So like my view is that open source is an early expression of the open research agenda principles. And it would actually be an interesting exercise to look at the FOSS principles and the UNESCO principles and see how they overlap. So I don't see them as incompatible. There is a underlying principle in the open source, which is the use of the community to drive improvement, and the freedom for the community to take, adapt, modify, and return to community. So those principles are quite strong. And there's quite a lot of commercial businesses that have very successfully built commercial models based on open source. So I mean, the obvious ones is Red Hat, and Atlassian would be another, but there's quite a few highly successful commercial businesses who are built upon a core of open source. And it's the community driving the improvements through the open source process that is enabling richer and broader commercial models. So Kevin picks up the point there with regard to universities commercialization efforts defaulting through the licensing option. Yes and no, Kevin, but I do see the point on the open source program office as a coherent approach to utilizing the open source channel or community as a form of, I suppose, expression of an open research, an aspect of the open research, run it through the open source channel. And that's something that I'm very interested in doing, and I know Kevin is as well. So it's a perfectly valid way, in my mind, to suit both the commercialization agenda, because the community drives the improvements, and the open research agenda in terms of getting the material out there to begin with. And then Stephen picks up the point with regard to where the National IP Protocol is somewhat deficient. In one sense, I view it in that I don't think the IP Protocol needed to make these comments on open source. That's almost a decision of the research partners to say, this is the mechanism by which we choose to achieve value by placing it in the open source domain. And it's kind of exclusive of the National IP Protocol, but it would be good for clarity, I suppose, whether to sort of make our reference in the National IP Protocol in terms of just to cover it off, to make sure it's clear. And also, as Stephen brings up the point of data, which also isn't well covered. But there's a class of intellectual property assets, other database rights, copyrights, which are quite valuable. And when I was talking earlier about your forward-looking view of a research project and identifying where intellectual assets will arise, and then determining the appropriate intellectual rights that may be associated with that, and then further determining what intellectual property protections may be required. There's a hierarchy of approaches with regard to intellectual asset management, but it kind of now, I think, puts everyone on notice to take a forward-looking view as to how that should be done, cognizant of a wider and richer set of channels or opportunities, both to, you know, address the open research agenda, but also to achieve commercialization benefit through using open source channels as well, and where appropriate, a more proprietary approach.
Yeah, I suppose that's a sort of a segue back to you, Daniel. That question from Kevin, I think, as Ian said there. Do you think that universities, academic research institutes should study, upgrade their structures, or include something like an open source program office? Where are the key challenges, you think, over the next 8 years in getting that to a 100% open research approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if such an office is a way of harmonizing the advice and policy environment within the institution, then that sounds like an excellent way forward. I think the broader challenges we're dealing with here, they vary. So there's a lot that could be covered off, but I think in the way we've laid out the action plan, we've placed that culture piece quite prominent front and center in order to just highlight that underlying all of this is a need to rework, to transition to a new set of expectations, a new set of skills, a new set of rewards and incentives. This is part of a transition that's been ongoing. So it's a continuation of a process, and it will take, of course, more time. But if we truly value these principles, we need to see these reflected in the sorts of requirements we have in our assessment of research and researchers, for example.
What do you mean by rewards and incentives there?
So this comes back to, for example, promotion and tenure, the sorts of awards. I mean, we see this on the funders side in the requirements being strengthened. Horizon Europe has open science front and center. It's really mainstreamed in how proposals are both evaluated and then how the outputs are disseminated. So it's becoming a system-wide requirement, a system-wide culture shift, but that always has to be borne in mind. So having the adequate supports in place at institutional level are key so that researchers understand and can be adequately assisted when they face these challenges. It's not something we do alone. It's something that requires many hands.
And one of your key priorities is to hold discussions, consultations with the academic research community as to how that mindset transition needs to happen in some instances.
Yeah, this will be an ongoing conversation, and we will, of course, have institutions, organizations at different levels of maturity also. So different kinds of supports will be needed according to the local context. Yeah, I see the national level and the actions that we've outlined, that's just one layer that needs to be connected into what happens internationally, what happens locally.
And speaking of an open-ended approach and a learning process for all concerned, Patricia, you were saying to us informally before the webinar started that the HRB is still on a learning process with its own platform, even though it seems to be working very well, and not just a learning process, but a systemic approach with other platforms, with other stakeholders to the broad research community.
Yeah, God, absolutely. I mean, say the HRB has to learn how to deliver research funding into the system and to work with the people who use that funding for research and to make sure that it's managed well and to ensure that it's rooted to maximum value. So the publication platform, I suppose, is one way we've been looking at things. The systems approach is probably most evident in working directly with the data system. So in recent times, I mean, we've looked at sort of, and we have a new policy on data management and sharing for HRB. We've introduced DMPs, data management plans, which will look at having some front loading these conversations and working directly with the research offices and the limited capacity that's available in the system at the moment in terms of sort of upskilled or existing data stewards within the system, we do see that that needs to be further developed. We've also partnered with the CSO to look at sort of providing researcher access to reuse COVID-19 data. We're piloting with the high performance computing guys and the HSE pilot on Safe Haven for Ireland for research data. And we see, I mean, when you talk about sort of the National IT Protocol, National IP Protocol and open research, I mean, that's all sort of within this huge basket of new developments in data legislation, the Data Act, the AI regulations, the medical device regulation, and the European Health Data Space sector legislation that came out earlier this week, or was it last week? And the first reactions are just coming out about that at the moment. So the whole movement is towards that data intensive research and how that can be developed at member states level, across national borders, and at an EU level, and then internationally. So there's a huge discussion at the moment. Lots of funding being pumped into the system at a European level, and lots of work being done in connecting into discussions nationally. So, for instance, the HRB is involved in 2 European projects at the moment, looking at towards the European Health Data Space, the TDIS project, and also on the PIRI, the COVID data platform. So all of these are, I mean, there's so much work being done in the background on how to develop the system approach and where we can fit into that system, both as a HRB system, but a national system and an international system. And I suspect that this will be front and center for the coming year, 2 years at least.
Yeah, I'm conscious of the time, folks. We've just a couple of minutes perhaps before, but I'll throw this question open to the panel. What advice does the panel have for researchers working with commercial partners who value their data and models as an asset to be protected? In some sectors, researchers appear to need to rely on such data to answer important research questions that can benefit wider society. I suppose I might go to you first, Ian. That is, the conundrum might be overstating, but that is some of the clarification stroke, discussion stroke, planning stroke, preparation that will have to be involved, isn't it?
Yeah, so I can't answer the question in its entirety. I can walk you up to the potential solution, then throw it over to Daniel. The formulation of the research question and the determination of the required data sources that are likely to help assess and address that research question. Collaborative research models exist to sort of create the framework for that to happen. The question then shifts to, once you've established an output, then what do you need to publish in terms of both the insight and sort of the response to the research question, but also the underlying data, because the provenance of the data that allow that research question to be addressed, and that which you are, required to publish or not, somewhere on that spectrum, and maybe that's where Daniel and Patricia might give us some insight. But basically, it's the far end of the research. TTOs know how to engage with commercial entities to get the data in the first place. It's what both parties wish to see as the output of the research, and what data can or cannot, may or may not, or whatever format the underlying data that was used to address the research question. I think that's where we're now discovering, new questions are surfacing around what needs to be put in the public domain with regard to that.
We might finish off by coming back to you, Daniel, and Patricia as well, if you want to comment, obviously, on this particular question, which I think is probably to the heart of some of the journey that a lot of people will need to make over the coming years. Daniel, any comments on that?
Patricia, do you want to come in there? I mean, I would agree with Ian. It just opens up a broader set of questions. It also depends particularly on what any conditions of the research and the funder. So the question really is much broader than what we could answer here. I would just emphasize that on the open side, a lot of these, whether it's to do with dissemination, IPR, data management planning, and so on, are ways to construct a different model of collaborative research, and looking at a broader set of impact. So keeping that eye on the bigger picture and what it could mean in terms of dissemination and impact for your field, both to the public and private, is key. So it's not that we broaden out the constraints, but we try and work from a different set of expectations.
Any final comments, Patricia?
Just, I would say, keep an eye on the European discussions and things like the public-private partnerships that have been established under Horizon Europe, or are being established under Horizon Europe, and how they work. The sort of guidance policies that are there, and they need to plan early upfront for how to get maximum value.
And increasingly, they will determine where funding goes, I presume.
Yes.
The one impression I get, like the documents and the research published on your platform, Patricia, is that this is a living discussion, and I can see lots of conversations arising over the years as Daniel in particular follows through on those targets. But for the time being and for this morning, I'd like to thank the three of you for what I thought was a very lively discussion indeed. Daniel, Patricia, and Ian, thanks indeed. Rowena, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Vincent. I hope you all found this morning's webinar useful. I did find it quite an interesting topic. I would like to thank again all our panelists for taking their time out of their busy schedules to be here with us this morning. Throughout the session, you would have heard the IP protocol referenced, and you can find a link to that along with a number of other useful links on the KTI website, such as a full suite of practical guides and model agreements. You will also find supports that help companies access the right expertise across the research performing organisations, and the RD&I funding tool, which lists the main funding supports at Irish and European level. We will be sending out an email shortly with links to any of the supports we've mentioned today, but we would also love to hear back from you. So if you have any feedback in relation to the webinars, or any suggestions on how we may change them, or any topics for upcoming webinars, we'd love to hear from you. Our next webinar is on the 14th of June, and details for this will be available in the coming days on the KTI website. Thanks again to our panel and to Vincent, and I'll now bring the webinars to a close. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.